joining us today from across Africa and beyond. My name is Bhekinkosi Moyo. I'm based at Wits Business School in Johannesburg, but I currently direct the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment. We're a Pan-African center that focuses on promoting the appropriate usage of African resources towards Africa's development. This Heritage Month in South Africa, which we have just celebrated, our partners, that includes the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, the Mandela Institute for Development Studies, Hadithi Africa, as well as CAPSI, have put together this webinar for us to raise awareness of Africa's heritage through a series of facts in order to create knowledge of and about Africa. That include resources, and here we're looking at land, minerals, human resources, among others, but also to raise awareness around our culture and history. And here, of course, we are looking at clothing, art, narratives, history, among others. But equally important is the issue of education. What kind of education, what kind of institutions and curriculum do we have in Africa, and how does it contribute towards development? So we have seen a series of facts that have been promoted by our partners throughout the couple of last weeks. Week one was focused on facts about education and institutions of education. Africa is home to some of the world's oldest universities. And week two focused on culture and language. There are approximately 3,000 tribes and 2,000 languages in Africa. And week three focused on resources. As you might know, one of the richest person to have ever lived in the world is Mansa Musa from Mali. And then, of course, we are joined today by a panel of eminent Africans and Pan-Africanists who will discuss each of these areas. Each panelist will speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll have questions. Please do send in your comments and your questions during the course of the presentations. You can use the question and answer function to post in your questions. And secondly, for those that require interpretation, if you look below, there's a global icon which has an interpretation function. You can click there to access interpretation into French. We also want to send apologies that Mrs. Machel, who is on the program, has actually joined us, but she won't be able to speak because she has to leave and join another meeting shortly, the George Bezos Memorial. And so we'll go straight into our agenda. I will invite Dr. Ibrahim Assane Mayaki, the CEO of the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, to give his welcoming remarks on African heritage and culture. Dr. Mayaki, I give the floor to you for 10 minutes, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this in the proper sense of the word of this ceremony. And I would like to thank all the speakers, and particularly recognize Mama Graça Machel, and thank her very sincerely for being part of this interaction. So I will fundamentally focus on 4 issues. But before focusing on these 4 issues, I wanted to cite President Nelson Mandela, who stated, and I quote, "When our first democratically elected government decided to make Heritage Day one of our national days, we did so because we knew that our rich and varied cultural heritage has a profound power to help build our new nation." You see, in this sentence, the word development is not mentioned. And the key words that I would like to enhance is rich and varied cultural heritage, profound power, and building our new nation. My profound sentiment, and you might find it paradoxical, is that being the CEO of the African Union Development Agency, I think that the way we engaged in development in the post-colonial period in the continent around after the 60s was based on a definition of development which was not in accordance with our heritage, our values, our diversity, and all the factors and the elements that Sheikh Anta Diop did refer to when he brushed and designed and presented the history of this continent. We imported a word, development, which was not in coherence with what we were. Development was a colonial concept which post-colonial states did implement. And we are still implementing in many corners of this continent the colonial dimension of what this type of development meant. So from the start, we were in a schizophrenic situation where we promoted development in contradiction to our values. Evidently, the constraints were quite important, and the potential space of our autonomous thinking was very limited. So given these circumstances, we did pursue on a trajectory which led us to what we thought was development, but that development was not in accordance with our values. So that's my first point. And I am profoundly convinced that the obstacles that we have faced, whether in stabilizing our governance systems, whether in empowering our communities, whether in explaining what we thought about development, all these issues were impacted by that disconnect. So my first point is that there was and there still is a disconnect between what we call development and what is our heritage. And this is why this, the citation, the quote of President Nelson Mandela is profound, because he's referring to building a nation. He's not talking about development, he's talking about building a nation. So Africa as a whole will not be built on a wrong foundation. In order to be built coherently, it has to dig into its heritage. My second point is heritage is an intelligent connection between the past and the future. And as an intelligent connection between the past and the future, it has to be directly linked to all our education systems. In how many African countries do we have primary education in our own languages? In my country, Niger, we did an experiment 30 years ago where primary education was fundamentally in our languages. in Hausa, in Jema, in Fulani, and the results of the children who were taught in their primary languages was not only better in all the disciplines, but all were also better in French, which is our colonial language. So by teaching in primary school our own languages, we did produce students who were better in fundamental disciplines, but all in their language, evidently, but also in French, which meant that it was a whole win-win situation. So 60 years after our independences, we have still a high number of African countries who cannot teach in primary school in their own languages. This is one of the most scandalous issues that we are facing. Because it's like we are negating our languages. And you know that the language does, and I'm not a specialist, and there might be a specialist of linguistics in the panel who might confirm or contradict what I'm saying, but from what I know is that language as a direct form of imprinting the way you think. And it allows you to have a integrity, a coherence, and an authenticity once you seize the value of what this language is. So in order to navigate between the past and construct the future, heritage based on a sound education which is linked to languages is absolutely fundamental. I still don't understand the reason why we cannot teach in primary school in our own languages. All the world does it. You go to Asia, Thailand, Japan, etc. They teach in their own languages. Why can't we? Are we stupid enough not to be able to do it? Or is it that our minds are still colonized and we have a complex vis-a-vis what we are? And Mama Graça Machel was referring to the body of knowledge which was built by scholars in order to reinforce the ideas that we should promote our heritage. And I think this is one of the fundamental issues. As long as our kids are not taught in their languages, we have a problem. We have a problem because we are inculcating in their minds that there is some types of superior languages somewhere. And it has, and this is my third point, it has a direct impact with leadership. And I will illustrate what I think. You see, if the mindset of our leaders is not based on a recognition of the values that we want to promote, and if these values are just about folklore and folklorical issues and are not reflected in the way our governance systems work, in the way our cultural industries behave, in the way we innovate scientifically, because that doesn't mean disconnecting from science. But if these values do not penetrate these domains, then we produce leaders, because societies produce leaders. Leaders emerge from societies. We produce leaders that perpetuate these type of mindsets. And this type of mindsets, based on a certain type of development, will not lead us very far, and will keep us in the situation in which we are, which is as somehow a situation of being behind and trying to catch up. And most of the development thinking that we are elaborating is about catching up. And the question is not to catch up, because by definition, if you try to catch up, it means that someone is superior to you and you are inferior to him. So you need to define who you are, and who you are is based on your own values. And then you define the rhythm of how you create your progress. And you are not trying to catch up somebody who doesn't look like you, who has different values, with whom you can have an intelligent interaction. So these were my 3 points. It questions what we think Pan-Africanism is. Pan-Africanism cannot be defined on the basis of what we think today development is. It defines the way we educate our children and the mindsets. And that education is the foundation of what they will be. And it defines how we see ourselves in a global world, which is not a 5, 10, 15-year perspective. It's a long-term perspective. So heritage is what allows us to construct what we are coherently in a long-term perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mayaki, and we want to appreciate the good work that you are doing with your team at the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD. I'm going to invite Professor Sande Ojo, the Executive Director of the African Indigenous Language Technology Institute in Pretoria. I see Professor have already started posting some powerful points. I give you the floor, 15 minutes, please, Prof, to give your intervention.
Okay, please, can you put on my PowerPoint? I sent a PowerPoint. They said they will display for me. Do I do it from here? Can I share my PowerPoint from here?
Yes, if you can share, Prof, from your end, even much better. Otherwise,
all right. Let me do that so I can control it. Sorry, just a moment. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can see my PowerPoint. I'm requested to present on what to know about African languages and cultures. Take notes that have pluralized languages and cultures. My agenda are just 3 points: what to know, what response, what future. As you can see, we're a continent of diversity when it comes to our linguistic and cultural heritage. We have over 2,000 distinct languages, over 54 nations, and though we are just barely 15% of the world population, but we are taking custody of near 1/3 of the world's languages. Really, like diversity indeed. What do we mean by diversity? There are various dimensions to our diversity. We have ethno-linguistic diversity. With regards to dialectical diversity that we have, each language on its own, we have a variety of language dialects. Now we use the word diglossia to describe that. When it comes to linguistic typologies, how they categorize the various structure of languages, phonologically, morphologically, syntactic, lexical, we are very diverse. Our scripts, writings from Ethiopic to Nko, now indigenous ones, different from Arabic and Roman, we are very, very diverse. Our diffusion, geographical spread of our languages, cross nation, Bantu, rural, and so on and so forth like that. The diversity of functional empowerment level of our national languages based on national language policies also is well known. You can see, let's take Zulu in South Africa, Yoruba in Nigeria. Look at that. The same word, same spelling, but we distinguish by our tones. We have a variety of tonal labial languages. And you can see we use our diacritic marks to distinguish the meanings of these words that have the same spelling and could be misconstrued if we do not put those diacritic marks. Our languages, African languages and cultures, it's embodiment of rich heritage, wealth that we have. You see, anthropologically, there's intertwined relationship between language and culture. They are not separable. Now, you can see that our languages are windows to our souls as African people, our unique indigenous knowledge systems, our cultural identities. You can see our languages as reservoirs, which we stored our philosophies, wisdom, indigenous medicine practice, and so on and so forth. It's rich heritage indeed. We use our languages and our culture to understand, organize, and transmit our indigenous knowledge, which are embedded in this our language and culture from one generation to the other. It's a roadmap for us to comprehend how socio-political, economic institutions and development take place. Before the colonialists come, we have our clear governance structure embodied in our languages, we can present in our languages and our culture. And of course, our languages and culture are a matter of African sustainable socio-economic development. Taking from the point of view from UNESCO, our language and culture, has capacity to reconcile our African ideas and values. It's a key contributor to dialogue, reconciliation, peace, and so on and so forth. Hence, it's a matter for our African sustainable socio-economic development. And of course, we need to know that we have demographic dividends of Africa having over 60% of its population being youth. All this, they are at present, given their technology-savvy nature and lack of what I call digital feasibility of our languages and culture, our youths are apparently alienated. Our Africanness is losing the steam among our youths. When they get to the internet, they pass less of our language and culture. They physically migrate from rural to urban area and do some disconnect with their roots. virtual migration on the internet, moving from cyberspace location to the other. Millions of our children have been born in diaspora, losing touch with our languages and culture. And of course, if you will see a study on the use of Facebook for African youth, reveals that it's dominated by the use of English, by Anglophone people, the Francophone, Lusophone, and the likes. That what dominate, not our language and culture. Of course, our African languages and culture constitute an endangered species. Globalization, where the powerful, dominate the weak, culturally, socially, economically. The danger of our language disappearing become increased. I need to point you to the statistics that while we have over 7,000 languages worldwide, spoken languages, 50% of these have been targeted in the not too distant future to disappear if nothing is done. Of course, it's recorded by UNESCO, 231 languages of the world disappeared. 37 of them are from sub-Saharan Africa. We're endangered species, culturally and linguistically. Fear and fear of our people are claiming ownership of some of our languages and consequently our cultures. Diminished functionality due to official language policy that precludes support for some languages because they are not official languages. I think South African is playing the best among all the African nations, having 11 official languages, 9 of which are indigenous languages. Of course, we still carry some mental slavery of a global language and culture being considered prestigious, the Anglophone, Francophone, and the likes. You all understand this reality. I want to underscore the point that the death of any of our languages and culture is like a burnt library. Library of what? Of our cultural heritage, embodiment. We as a people. This results in our losing socio-psychological and some socio-psychological effects. We lose our cultural identity, inferiority complex, living with second fiddle play mentality. That's what happened. 10 of about over 10,000 languages of the world dominate 80% of the information on the internet as of date. None of these 10 is of an African origin. This is due mainly to what we call scientifically linguistic data sparsity challenge, the paucity of digitized linguistic data that we can use as basis for building robust language technology that will provide digital feasibility to our languages and culture. So our language and culture lack digital feasibility, resulting in digital language exclusion on the cyberspace, digital information inequality, as I've expressed earlier, socioeconomic second fiddle playing. What do I mean by this? I got these statistics of late. I was involved in a consultancy project with some language service providing company that's trying to penetrate to Africa. We have on record the language services provisioning market globally constitutes over $50 billion. But you can see African has only 0.0% share of this multi-billion-dollar market. Thus, we are socioeconomically disadvantaged in profiting from our rich linguistic and cultural heritage. Others are making business with our languages, but we are handicapped from doing this. So this inadequate global digital feasibility of our African indigenous knowledge results because we have to convey our indigenous knowledge correctly in our own language, but our languages are not adequately digitized. Thus, making Africa, we are more of foreign knowledge consumer than original knowledge producer in the landscape in the global knowledge space. What should be our response? The fourth industrial revolution era is a reality, and it conveys a semblance of survival for the fittest. It's been proposed that any language not on the digital space, according to UNESCO, will disappear. It's a matter of time. Our languages are grossly under-resourced in terms of what it takes to provide it digital feasibility to reduce the probability of danger of disappearing. What's our response? The UNESCO advocates the need to effectively exploit ICT to leverage digital feasibility of our languages and culture. 2020 have been declared a decade of indigenous languages. There's a charge from the African Union asking that we have the responsibility, we Africans, we have the responsibility, not others outside Africa, to render our African languages not only a wider feasibility, but also an academic and scientific status through sound computational linguistic research. Now, in responding to this charge, we need to take cognizance of UNESCO's advocacy and exploit the advances in human language technologies to grant physical feasibility to our indigenous African languages. This we can do through collaborative engagement among stakeholders, the populace mental and cultural decolonization. As my colleague from NEPAD earlier said, we should not be taking pride in being reacculturized into a different culture, different languages. Political leadership commitment to preserving and promoting our African languages, not treating our rich multilingual and cultural diversity as an aberration, rather a rich resource to be exploited for African socio-economic development. The academia has a role to play, taking seriously research and innovation in leveraging the math, science, and engineering and technology embodied in our linguistic and cultural heritage. We need to take advantage of our youth demographic dividend by having a critical mass of well-capacitated and empowered African youth with research, innovation, and entrepreneurial skills in appropriate African language technology and services provisioning. Let's get them to do business with our languages.
Prof,
Coming towards the end, we're responding to this. Hello?
You have 1 minute to
I just round up. This is the end. We have a vision that no African indigenous language should die. We must be driven by the ethos of sustainable African solution to African problem. We need to advance the knowledge of our African languages and culture in the global knowledge space. And of course, it keep our youth for doing business with our languages. Lastly, and it will need to end what future for our language and future and our cultures. The vision of our founding forefathers, particularly President Kwame Nkrumah, in 1963, I quote, "You see, how we can accumulate machinery, link our various states, and stone the wall with our hydroelectric power, drain marshes and swamps. You know, it is within the possibility of science and technology to make all this plausible. Let us exploit our rich linguistic and cultural heritage in the pursuit of this vision of our founding fathers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. I already see lots of comments in response to your presentation. We will get back to some of the points that you have raised. If I could invite Mr. Francis Danials, the Director of Anibok Investments Research Chambers Private Limited, to talk to us about African resources and African wealth. Francis, 15 minutes starts now.
Okay, thank you very much, Becky. Let me start by thanking Minds and VITS and the other sponsors of this webinar for inviting me. I had a conversation with Karatilwa about how she interpreted my topic. She said she wondered why Africans were poor when it had so much gold, diamonds, and other minerals. How did it go, in her words, from hosting Mansa Musa, the great ruler of the Mali Empire, and fabled to be the wealthiest man of his time, and building the 16,000-kilometer walls of Benin, to today's savanna of poverty? I can say confidently that Karatilwa's questions to me are too difficult for me to answer, but I'm going to attempt to outline a framework that might stimulate debate and, time permitting, suggest some ideas for how Africans might increase their individual and collective wealth. For this talk, I'm going to use the World Bank's concept of wealth. And the World Bank thinks of wealth for a country as a portfolio of assets, whether domestic or foreign, that enables its residents to produce its annual gross domestic product. That wealth obviously is owned by individuals, private or civic groups, whether companies, cooperatives, or communities, and governments. The portfolio comprises natural capital, non-renewable assets like minerals, and renewable assets like arable land, produced capital, factories, dams, irrigation systems, houses, all manner of property, plant, and equipment manufactured by human beings, and human capital, the educated ingenuity of human beings in a country, acting in their personal and collective capacities. And finally, net foreign assets. Underlying all of those assets lies the caliber of a country's governors, administration, systems of justice, tax collection capabilities, and the degree of congruence between the beliefs and heritage of a country and its current institutions. That constitutes a subterranean contributor to a country's wealth. How wealthy is Africa? The numbers I'm going to give are estimates and must be treated with caution. They're very rough estimates. But according to the World Bank, in 2014 dollars, Africa's total wealth amounted to $27.5 trillion, which at the time was equal to about 6.6 South Africas. So we've got 54 countries. Their combined wealth is equivalent to 7 South Africas. Mauritius had the highest African per capita wealth at $97,000, followed by Botswana at $95,000 and South Africa at $77,000. What counts though over the long haul is the distribution of wealth. And in that regard, we all know that there's a lot to be desired. To put these numbers in context, India's wealth and per capita wealth was 23.6 trillion, and the per capita wealth of India was $18.2 thousand. China had total wealth of $148 trillion, and per capita was $108,000. And then the US was sitting at $314 trillion with 983,000 as the per capita wealth. Africa has 2.4% of total world wealth of 1,143 trillion and 15% of the population. What is worth noting about the World Bank's definition of wealth is that it includes the net present value of the population's earnings over the lifetime. By contrast, in the stock market, which I inhabit daily, we exclude the net present value of people's earnings. And there, the statistics are somewhat similar. According to the statistics, the total market capitalization of Africa is 261 billion as of Friday. 89% of that was South Africa. And that was a very tiny fraction of the global market capitalization, it was about 0.05% of that. The most important aspect, though, is the composition of our wealth. Generally speaking, poor countries have a higher share of their wealth coming out of natural capital than productive capital. So for example, a country like Kenya, which is often considered to be lacking in natural resources, quote unquote, because it doesn't have lots of minerals and oil, gets 35% of its wealth from natural capital, 17% from produced capital. By contrast, natural capital accounts for a mere 2.4% of US wealth, and produced capital constitutes 22%. Regardless, the biggest part of capital for a country comes from human beings. So in the case of America, it is 78%, 52% in Zimbabwe, 56% in Nigeria, and 48% in India. Another way, though, of thinking about wealth in Africa is to think of it through the eyes of wealthy Africans themselves. This year, Standard Bank Africa published the Africa Wealth Report 2020 on the subject, The Art of Creating Wealth. Interviewees came from Mauritius, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana. People who are wealthy, defined as having a net worth of at least $1 million. 56% of those interviewed said that the most important path to wealth for them was entrepreneurship, followed by 27% with an executive career and 19% citing a family business. In terms of the favorite industries out of which their wealth emerged, was real estate, construction, trade, financial services, manufacturing, oil and gas, technology, and retail. Note the absence of agriculture. By and large, they prefer to keep their wealth in tangible assets. And take note that they have an aversion to holding their assets in government debt. So when you look at the comments of the wealthy Africans, it's quite clear that entrepreneurship has a lot to offer Africa. Let me turn to what we can learn from this, and I'll start with agriculture. It is worth noting that if you look at the Asian countries which have prospered, and I think of Japan, I think of Taiwan, I think of South Korea, I exclude Singapore. In each of them, one of the first steps on the path to prosperity was some kind of land reform in which security of tenure for the tillers of land was secured. The capacity to demarcate precisely the contours of a person's property or land or farm was created. And as a consequence, farmers in those countries were able to invest over numerous growing seasons. Sadly, in Africa, that doesn't exist, and it's something that we need to keep in mind. The second point, which is pretty obvious, is that focusing our assets on education and health will be very helpful to us. The third point, though, deals with the quality of governance. And on that, the point to make is that governance is derived ultimately from the heritage and values of people. If that is not recognized, the kind of constitutions which can be created will not have durability. And yet, for investments, especially produce capital to occur, there has to be confidence in the Constitution. I have no proof for what I'm about to say, but I don't think it is accidental that Botswana is one of the wealthiest countries in Africa. Why? It is the only African country which from its inception created a house of chiefs, granting to them a function of advising the Westminster selected parliament on rules relating to indigenous property. And as a consequence, Botswana has not had problems relating to tenure and its indigenous form of property, primarily cattle. If I can give another example, there's only one country in the world where the indigenous rulers, defined as the head of state, circulate among 9 families. And that country is Malaysia, which was roughly similar to Ghana in 1957. That institution was created to sit alongside a Westminster system because of the peculiar history of Malaysia having several different kingdoms. Why does this matter? The reason why it matters is because a state's coercive power is insufficient to deliver peace on its own. And the social values of the residents, in fact, enable the state to function optimally. If I can give some statistics relating to the court system. Ghana, for example, has 376 judges for 31 million people.
So Francis, you have a minute to try and
finish.
wrap up. Yeah.
Okay. South Africa has a much better ratio. What you will find is that countries with very, very high populations per judge have great disputes, and it takes a tremendous amount of time to settle them. That's an example of the disadvantage of not relying on your heritage. So anyway, in summary, all I would say is that Africa's wealth is going to grow if and only if we focus on expanding the productive capacity of the continent, the produce capital of the continent, and the caliber of our youth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis, for that presentation. I already see some questions that posed to you. We'll come back to them. Can we move on to Dr. Nkosana Moyo, the founder of Minds? He introduced himself earlier as unemployed, but Nkosana has a long history working on African issues. Dr. Moyo is going to talk to us about African education in the continent and how to make it easier for the youth to embrace African culture. Dr. Moyo, over to you. 15 minutes starts now.
Thank you very much, Peggy. So I'm going to follow Francis' approach a little bit. I don't want to be backward looking, and I'll explain why just now. So let me start off by acknowledging Dr. Mayaki, because he did most of my job for me as far as education is concerned. But let me just repeat to highlight one of the issues he put on the table, which I think are a big problem for us. Traditionally, we were educated through the family and the society in which we live, the village, if you like. So our education was grounded and embedded in daily experiences. That's how we got educated. And when Dr. Mayaki was talking about primary education being in non-mother tongues and creating a very unstable foundation for further education, I think he put his finger on one of the most problematic issues about African education at the moment, that our grounding is not firm enough, because it's from an early childhood, and studies have shown this, that when children have their early education through their mother tongue, they grasp the content of what they are learning much more firmly than when it's taught in a colonial language. So I just want to leave that there, that we've got a problem in our education system, and we need to find a way of grounding our education within the environment, especially for the young child, in order to create a firm foundation for further education. But let me tell you what really concerns me about this. Our conversations, maybe even on heritage, is that I think we tend to be very nostalgic. We are backward looking and we want to praise what we used to do. So let me give you two idioms that are in Shona idioms, which should inform us how to tackle the challenges that we face. The first one says, "Mwanari mbereko, mwanasinga chema nofira mbereko." For those who don't understand, Shona, what this simply means is that when you're carrying a child the traditional way, on your back, the way our mothers normally did carry us, if a child so carried does not cry, then they will die in the bereko, i.e. the contraption we use to carry our children. When a child is hungry and they don't cry, they'll die of hunger. But there is a second one which is fascinating too, which we should pay heed to. And this says, "Matakazakare anyara dzivana," i.e. you cannot quieten a hungry child by telling them how well you used to feed in the past. You cannot quieten or satisfy the hunger of a child by simply being nostalgic about how well you used to feed your family. And lastly, in terms of the things I want to hang my comments around, is the concept of obliquity. A book written by John Kay. Obliquity is just a derivative from oblique, i.e. indirect. And the importance of this is that when you look at human endeavor, quite often, if not always, almost, when we are clear about our objectives, we often achieve them much more effectively through indirect methods, obliquely, in other words. So what am I getting at? As already articulated by Dr. Mayaki, we are where we are. Colonization has caused us huge challenges in terms of our evolution as a society. If I can generalize and lump Africa all together, I know it's a generalization, but I hope you will forgive me. So we are where we are. And I think the question we should be asking ourselves is, given that we are where we are, all of the things we can complain about are like water under the bridge. How do we move on from here into creating circumstances which allow our youth in particular to embrace our ways much more willingly? Why is this the relevant question? It's the relevant question because we don't seem to be aware that a willingness to self-assert in a manner that is genuine, that is yourself, is grounded on having gained credibility from performance. You have people want to associate with success. Now, if I use just two areas to illustrate how problematic this is for us, education and health. We as African people have become the worst agents of colonization in a manner that the real colonizers could not have imagined. How have we done this? We've taken our institutions of education and made them so inferior that all who can afford it and aspire to a good education will not go to our institutions. Similarly, as far as health is concerned, we've taken our health institutions and made them so basic and so unattractive that those who can afford it, again, similarly, will not go to them. Even our rulers do not go to them. In fact, I shouldn't say even, in particular, our rulers do not go to them. They don't even go on the African continent. They will go to Paris, London, Malaysia, and what have you. They rule over us and they expect our children to go to these places, and we expect our youths to be proud of themselves and reclaim our heritage when everything we are presenting to them is almost an explicit statement which says everything that we do is inferior and unacceptable and unattractive and ugly, and everything that the other, i.e. essentially, unfortunately, the colonizer, the former colonizer, everything they do actually is to the acceptable standard. In my opinion, the debate about heritage is not going to take us very far unless we realize that we have to deliver performance today in order to then be able to backtrack and reconnect with our heritage. We need to create things which make us proud today, which create credibility for ourselves and our children in particular today into the future, for us to then get comfortable reclaiming who we are, reclaiming our heritage, and making it a fabric of how we then build going into the future. This, for me, is the critical issue. Let's not pretend that we are standing on a firm platform on which we can talk about heritage, feel proud about it, because we're not. And so the question again I ask is, how do we obliquely, indirectly, rather than through claiming it or demanding it, because you cannot demand, you will have to create a pathway where it becomes an easy thing to do, especially for the young, to say, I want to be seen in African attire. I want to wear my hair as a Black woman or man. I want to speak my indigenous language. I want to learn in my indigenous language. I want to go to my country's institutions of health and education. Once we've done that, if we do that and succeed, my opinion is that the pathway to reclaiming our heritage and making it firmer as we move into the future will be much, much easier. So any debate, as far as I'm concerned, in fact, I could go further and use things like food security. We've become a continent of aid. So we are not, you know, what makes, and I'm sorry I'm going to step on toes as far as gender is concerned, but what makes a man, how can a man be proud when they are not able to feed their own family and they go cup in hand to go and beg to feed their family? We see our leaders, our heads of state, they specialize in being beggars. They are teaching us to socialize, to begin to be non-proud in providing for ourselves, but to take pride in going begging for food. And we think we can reclaim what exactly? What are we going to reclaim in terms of heritage when not even food security, education, health, all of these things now are predicated on somebody other than us, somebody other than our community can deliver these things to acceptable standards rather than ourselves. I think we've got a problem. And yeah, when we were chatting about this conversation, I had a hard time persuading the organizers to allow me to take this path because they wanted me to make comments which would make us feel good about ourselves. But I think we've got a problem when we don't challenge ourselves. Let's not leave it to other people to tell us where things are broken. Let's be the ones who interrogate the ways in which we should be doing better. Let's not settle for mediocrity and leave other people to point out to us that things are not as well as they could be. Maybe, to be fair, being a Zimbabwean, I have become more pessimistic because my country, I think, is doing particularly badly. So other Africans who are listening on this platform, excuse me, and I hope you will indulge and understand the context, but I dare say, if I could be so bold, that there are very few African countries that could actually be proud of the journey they've traveled since independence to where they are today. And hence my attempt to persuade all of us to say, let's be harder on ourselves. Let's understand what meritocracy is in order to build a firm platform, a platform we can be proud of, and a platform which will give us credibility amongst ourselves, but even internationally. Look at examples. As of today, on the African continent, begrudgingly, Kagame has got more voice than a lot of other African heads of states. Why? You may not like his human rights approach, but he's come across as somebody who is a competent manager with clarity as to where he wants to go, his society, his country. Lee Kuan Yew, Francis alluded to the Malaysian example. Malaysia, Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew during his time, he had more leverage, he was listened to globally more than much bigger African countries because he had credibility. He was seen as somebody who could be listened to because he had something to say, in spite of running a city-state, as opposed to the countries, big countries, African countries that his counterparts were running. So when you look at the Eastern world, they've had exactly, in my opinion, not exactly, but very similar journeys in terms of abuse, colonization, and so on and so on. They didn't go preaching to anybody about, I want you to respect me. I want you to do this for me and this and the other. They set about very steadfastly rebuilding their countries, using their own methods until the world could not ignore them because they had succeeded so much. Look, China, Japan, your Singapore's, Malaysia, all of these countries, they are now accepted in the global family of nations, not because they asked, not because they went with a begging bowl, but because they steadfastly set about achieving their objectives with clarity, and they created the platform on which nobody can ignore them.
Dr. Moyo, you have a minute to wrap up.
We, on the other hand, in my opinion, are spending way too much energy focused on asking other people. We demand respect. What the world has done for us is to humor us. So they give us seats in all these boards, you know, IMF, World Bank, ADB, which we claim to own, but we actually don't own it. They humor us, but we've got no voice. We go sit there and spend lots of money, but it's a waste of money because nobody listens to what we've got to say because they think it's not worth listening to. So excuse me for taking a rather controversial stance, but I'm quite happy to entertain questions because I think that's the reality of our continent today. And if we don't change it, talking about heritage or reclaiming our heritage is going to be much tougher, if not impossible. Thanks, baby, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moyo, for the intervention. It's always good to have a critical reflection on ourselves, because if we don't do that, then we are not doing any justice. I have a couple of questions that have come through from the participants, and please feel free to answer some of those that may not be directed specifically to somebody. And I'll also invite Dr. Mayaki as well to join in answering some of the questions. So Francis, there's a question from Motheo Mtimkulu, who says, how do African nations come together and create a concerted effort to stem illicit funds from Africa? And I think the question also goes ahead to say, could the AU perhaps introduce a financial oversight authority to track funds that have left the continent? And Dr. Moyo, there is a question that says, in your opinion, how do you propose changes to address curricula in many cases, to address these deficiencies that exist in our education system? And then there's a question for Professor Ojo from Timkulu, who says, do we continue to blame the West and globalization for the breakdown of African languages or the African language pride? Should the blame not be on ourselves, the Africans, who build a superiority amongst Africans, leading to the lack of attaining unity? And then Morris says, Tanzania has used Kiswahili in all spheres of life, including in teaching. This has led to unity. How can we promote a few languages from Africa to a continental level in order to build African unity? And then I will ask this question. Nana says, we are not investing in making our youth proud of Africa's heritage and culture. How committed are our leaders to this agenda? What are the policies, infrastructure, systems that our leaders are putting in place in order to get young people to be proud of who they are? And I think that, Dr. Moyo, you can take that as well, because I think it addresses some of what you were saying. And then Dr. Pindai Stole says, with all the level of positive anger and motivation to reclaim our heritage, why is this not manifested in every African leader's national development agenda? Do we have wrong leaders? If so, what should be done? Maybe we can take those questions, 2 minutes possible from each panelist. And then if we do have some time, I have some other questions as well.
Yeah, Becky, I'm afraid I didn't hear your question in its entirety. There was a part about stopping something. I couldn't hear it. Would you mind repeating it?
Yeah, so the question was basically saying, what can the AU do to stop the illicit financial outflows from African countries? Is there a possibility for a financial oversight body to track some of these funds? And I'm sure you can refer to the Thabo Mbeki committee that was done by the AU a few years back.
Sure. Yeah, the answer simply is that African central banks and banks need to be more diligent. Under the current system, money which is remitted has to be accompanied by statement of purpose. If you look at South Africa, for example, when money comes into South Africa, one has to explain the purpose for which the money is being received, and South African foreign exchange investigators can go into a fair amount of detail. So I think that the scale of illicit outflows is frankly a reflection of the mediocre capacity of a lot of the African investigating institutions. That's really the answer.
Sorry, can I just intervene because on the same issue? I want to disagree with Francis. And the reason I want to disagree, Francis, that is like a rubber band fix. People, in fact, I think, I once almost got lynched when I pointed out that for me, it was a good thing that Africans take their money away because it means they understand risk. So until African countries run their affairs in such a way that I don't lose the value of my money, this won't be necessary. Yeah. So I think the fix in the medium to long term has to be running our economies in such a way that there is no risk of me losing my money in terms of its value, or just assets, which again, this governance issue where the issue of title doesn't mean anything. I can lose. So if you create insecurity, either through lack of respect for ownership of property or the time value of money, you will never be able to legislate it away. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, but Beck, if I may just put a qualification there. A country which is able to police capably is unlikely to be a country which has lots of indicia of insecurity. In fact, it's precisely the condition of being incompetent, insecure, and corrupt, which allows the illicit flow. So if you want to build a capable capacity of checking, necessarily you have to change your state in very fundamental ways.
Okay, I suppose you're saying the same thing, but you're coming at it almost back to front. I'm saying run your country properly and a sound economy to protect the value of the money.
Sure,
but
yeah.
You're right in the sense of when you say that reflects competence, you're right that it's likely to therefore reflect competence across the board. I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, I see Dr. Mayaki wants to intervene as well, and then we'll move on to Professor Ojo and come back to you.
Very quickly, I'm not a specialist of a question, but I co-chair currently UN panel on illicit financial flows worldwide. What happens in the African case is that roughly 80% of the illicit flows are the consequence of companies, especially multinationals, not paying their taxes. So it is tax evasion and tax avoidance, especially in the mining sector. So the illicit financial flows are fundamentally the consequence of our incompetence to manage our tax system properly. So that's where, you have corruption, money laundering, etc. But more than 3/4 of illicit financial flows are due to incompetence in managing our tax system. I just wanted to mention that, and it's also reflected in President Beki's report. So we have to make a lot of progresses in managing the issues of tax evasion and tax avoidance, because many companies evidently will tell you that tax avoidance is illegal. It's not illegal, but it is illicit because it's a way of escaping the norms of the tax systems that we have. I stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mayaki. Prof. Ojo, there were a couple of questions. I don't know if you want me to repeat them or you got them.
I got some of them, and in fact, I reply online.
Okay, so just pick the ones that you think are pertinent, just to respond to them.
Now, the pertinent ones regards to the one where Swahili has been adopted, being widely used in Tanzania, maybe mostly in East Africa. Why that is possible is that Swahili must have been declared an official language, just as we have in South Africa, Nigeria, other places. But why that is good? If every groupings, political grouping in Africa can do that, pick official language here and there. But the challenge with the official language is that what happens to the other tens of languages and culture in Tanzania? So we need to go beyond just declaring official languages and promoting just one language. We must see how do we leverage other languages such that we can achieve our unity through diversity, not through rule of language policy. So, and the technology is there now, human language technology advances that can enable us to do this. Also, enough of blame game. Colonia has gone, my colleague from Ghana was talking about 60 years of independence. If we have not decolonized ourselves for that period, that's now our own problem. We need to take our destiny into our hand and provide African solution to African problems, not passing the buck again. Our political leadership need to take responsibility. That's the comment I want to make on that.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. Moyo, there were a couple of questions around African leaders in not investing in young people. How do we change the current curriculum and the mechanisms in our education system?
Yeah. So let's start with the curriculum one. You know, I'm not an education specialist, but I'm persuaded to think that Dr. Mayaki hit on one of the key components of this issue about how we tackle the issue of the African curriculum by laying the foundations where the language of instruction, when children do not know, let's say primary education, in the earlier stages of their education anyway, that the language of instruction, the medium of instruction must be a mother tongue, and that will help to embed the education and the concepts in the children's minds, because mother tongue naturally will reflect an understanding of their own environment. The objects that are used will be from their own environment. I would say that's one of the key components of this issue of how you deal with the curriculum. But I want to go back to my issue of obliquity. I think given where we are now, a huge revamp on education will result in most of the people who can afford it running away from our education system. I think we need to indirectly understand that our credibility to revamp things depends on us creating a platform of competence. So let me give you an example. In science, for instance, if you want today to go and say that Einstein was wrong, let's say you think he was wrong in his theory of relativity, you figured out he was wrong, and you're coming from a position of not having achieved anything scientific in your own way, people are going to look at you and just laugh at you. But if you say you are a Nobel laureate and you've done things that are wonderful scientifically, and then you say to one day, actually, I think Einstein was wrong, and you can put across a theory, people at least will engage with it. If you are a nobody and you've not achieved anything, they won't even engage with it. They just dismiss you out of hand. So what I'm saying here is this issue of obliquity. Let's try to create a culture of excellence in what we do in order to create a platform of credibility, which will allow us credibility with our own people, not just foreigners, our own people, to then say, you know what, if my government, which has done these things so well, the economy is working well, the health system in this country is good, the infrastructure is good, they are coming up and saying, we propose to change the education, the curriculum in this way, I think I can go along with it. That platform of credibility is another important component. Now, the issue of leaders and young people and investing in young people. Some of you may know, I have spent quite a bit of time trying to grapple with this issue. And where I've landed as of today is that young people are actually to blame. I can hear a revolution out there against me, but bear with me, be patient with me. This continent is a young continent. The young people are in the majority. all our institutions, no matter how imperfect, are majoritarian. Our choice of leaders leaves a lot to be desired. But if we're doing it using majoritarian mechanics, I think it's a logical conclusion to say, therefore, we end up with the leaders that we have because of what young people choose to do or not to do. So if young people get more clarity on what kind of Africa they want to create and what kind of leadership would lead them, would partner them actually into creating that kind of Africa, there would be a huge force in beginning to impact the quality of our leadership because they've got the numbers to do it. So instead of looking to old people, I think young people should now be looking to themselves to use their numbers to make those numbers count in terms of the caliber of the leaders that we are allowing to run our continent, and turn it around to people who can partner them to create the Africa that will work for them.
Thank you, Dr. Moyo. Just a few minutes left. There are probably two questions that I want to pose, and any one of you can take them. So the first question is, given that our post-colonial African leaders converse or speak with their colonial masters in the language of the oppressor, whether it's French, English, or Portuguese, will they ever reach equality in negotiations in all various spheres? Isn't there an imbalance given that you are actually trying to catch up? The second question is, how can we make our indigenous languages produce economic value for Africans? And the third question is, how do we move from where we are when our systems are so corrupt? So those three questions, if any one of you can take a minute to just respond just by bullet points, and then we will hand over to the organizers to close the session.
Let me respond on the issue of bringing economic value out of our languages. Is that okay?
Yes, Prof, please go ahead. And then we'll go to Dr. Mayaki.
Okay. Now, as I gave the statistics, language services provisioning market worldwide is over 50 billion. But currently, Africa is sharing 0.05% of that. Part of what I put there is, how do we empower our youths in the research and innovation, entrepreneurship, or translating our language products, technology products and services, into economic value. It's already going on, but we're not taking advantage. The platform is there. We need to empower our youth to look in that direction, grow them as interpreters, localizers, translators, transcreators, and so on and so forth, all on making money out of our languages. So it's already available there. We just need to exploit. But we need leadership to look in that direction.
Dr. Mayaki, you can come through. I saw your hand.
Okay, thank you. I agree with the definition which has been given right now by Professor Sunday on empowering through certain mechanism. But fundamentally, I am in disagreement with the concept of empowerment. Because if you wait to be empowered, you will never be empowered. And that's where I join Nkosana Moyo, because in a continent where 75% of the population is under 25, these youth have a power. They have a power over numbers. They have the potential to organize themselves in order to have themselves reflected in the power structures. So you can't complain about leaders if you have a power and the leaders who are representing you do not reflect the power that you have. So there is a contradiction that the youth needs to solve. And you can see in many African regions and countries that there is a beginning of mindset change rising from the fact that the youth has understood that power is in their hands. It's just a question of organizing in order to seize it properly. So that's the first question. The second issue, the relation between post-colonial leaders and colonial masters, I think the equation is no longer in that domain, because the sons of the colonial masters are working within a globalized world where they fight for their interests on very critical issues, whether it is on science, technology, innovation, whether it is on artificial intelligence, etc. So the battles to be fought will need a form of meritocracy. And that meritocracy will need to be balanced with democracy, because the question is not to have an elite disconnected from the masses. And that's where education becomes extremely important. And that's why education because education in our languages allows us to be smarter and more entrepreneurial, more skillful, with more capacity to innovate. And thirdly, lastly, one of the big obstacles of Africa's development is its fragmentation in 55 countries. None of our countries alone will be able to play a significant role on the global scene within the context of the current globalization. So we need to have regional solutions. And I frequently repeat, in the next 10 years, 90 to 95% of the current seated heads of states will no longer be heads of states in Africa. So in the next 10 years, you will have a radical change of leadership. So the main question that we need to ask ourselves is, what type of leaders will emerge in the years to come? And will these leaders be able really to implement the ideas of Pan-Africanism? And it's our responsibility to all of us to make sure that the conditions are created, and I know what Minds is working on, but the conditions are created so that we see, and the next 10 years will be critical. The next 10 years will be the emergence of leaders that you and I, we don't know who they are. But those that you know today will no longer be there. So working on the emergence of these leaders is the fundamental question we need to work on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mayaki. On that note, I think we don't have much time left. I would like
Professor Moyo to add something on that, because he has been working on this issue for a long time. Mm-hmm. If you allow, huh?
You said you want to add, Dr. Mayaki?
Mr. Moyo.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask the organizers, if they, because we don't have time, whether Mr. Danials and Dr. Moyo have their final parting shots, and then I will hand over to the organizers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Francis, you want to go? Well, okay. I mean, I'm not sure whether Francis is on or not. So,
no, sorry, I was saying that you should go first.
Yeah, okay. So on let me tackle the issue of language. Francis, I mean, the issue of language is fascinating, because language, other than the platform as a mode of instruction when people are young, language has got a dual function, in the sense of it's almost like a tool, a discipline, like science, like law, like mathematics. And the issue is not so much of language, which is not a mother tongue, in terms of our leaders not being able to negotiate on an equal basis with their former colonial masters, so to speak. It's because we are not choosing the right people who've achieved mastery, because we've got them. We've got smart people who can achieve master of language the same way they master science and law and as a tool of interaction. So I wouldn't worry too much. The issue that highlights is that we're not using meritocracy in our choice of leaders. That is the fundamental problem. Language itself is just an instrument, like I say, like law, like maths, and so on and so on. And we are quite capable of mastering it to the correct level to hold our own against anybody. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Moyo. Francis, a minute if you can.
Yes, I'll just make, first of all, I wanted to take the question on corruption. I just simply point out that China has a lower ranking in corruption perception index than South Africa. It ties roughly with Ghana. Countries like Taiwan were notorious for corruption. It seems that there is corruption allied with competence, which eventually ends up in some kind of development, and then corruption allied with incompetence and mediocrity, which seems to traverse Africa. So I think the focus should really be on competence. In terms of my closing thought, I would simply say that as Africans, we need to focus intently on how to expand the volume of productive capacity and capital in the continent. The evidence suggests that if we do not increase significantly the amount of productive capital in the continent, we will not be able to progress. It seems to amount almost to a necessary condition to have a larger volume of productive capital in your wealth than natural capital. And then other things seem to work in tandem. So that really is my closing thought. One way we can measure that is to look at the cost of money. As the cost of money goes down, the capacity to invest in productive capital will expand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis, and thank you very much to all the panelists, Dr. Mayaki, Dr. Moyo, Professor Ojo, for this engaging conversation. As always, we don't have enough time to cover all the pertinent questions that have been raised. I want to invite Mwanja Nganjo from the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, to say a few words on behalf of the partners. Mwanja, over to you. And good evening from my side.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moyo. Time just went by so very, very quickly. It just flew as we all sat here enthralled and mesmerized by the wealth of the knowledge and the body of discussions that our eminent speakers and panelists had to share with us today. And just before the conversation started, before we went live, Mrs. Graça Machel actually pointed out that we should not only celebrate Heritage Week this week for the sake of celebrating who we are, but also we should do it with self-awareness. It's only when we're self-aware that we will be able to engage in the global space more effectively. Mrs. Machel also exhorted us to work together as stakeholders in order for us to build a body of wealth on African heritage. I'll just quickly touch through the points that I've picked out from the engagements that we've had this afternoon. Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, the CEO of AED and NEPAD, pointed out that the definition of development itself, we've taken it too lightly. It's not about catching up with those whose values are different from our own. To begin with, when looking at our primary school education, most of us, majority of us on the continent, have had education in languages that are not our own. So already that puts us at a disadvantage. Dr. Mayaki also pointed out that heritage is that which allows us to define who we are coherently. And then next we heard from Professor Sande Ojo, who gave us some stats in saying that out of the 231 world languages that have disappeared thus far, 37 of them are from Africa. He therefore made the case for us to preserve our African languages, and he pointed out that the digital space actually provides us with effective and easier means for us to preserve our languages. We also listened to Mr. Daniel Francis, who looked at wealth from different angles. And he pointed out that in asking the question about how wealthy Africa is, we should not just look at it in terms of monetary wealth, but he also said that what matters more importantly is the fact that we should take cognizance of how that wealth is actually distributed. And he also made the point that the biggest part of capital is actually in human beings. And Dr. Nkosana Moyo also challenged us this afternoon when he looked at the topic of how do we begin to attract African youth to embrace our African culture and our African heritage. He pointed out that we cannot look at this issue through nostalgia, looking at our traditions, what worked best in the past, from our traditional ways, but we should look at what matters more importantly today. If we've got failing education systems, if we've got failing health systems, most of our systems are inferior, it will be very, very difficult for African youth to remain, to have their allegiance to our African heritage and culture. Therefore, that was very thought-provoking and very, very challenging for us. We need to attract African youth through providing them with better means to compete globally. Ladies and gentlemen, the conversation this afternoon has unfortunately drawn to a close. Would therefore like to thank all our participants, our eminent speakers, our moderator, Dr. Bhekinkosi Moyo, our interpreters, and all our participants. It's been wonderful engaging with you all. And I think I speak on behalf of everybody to say that such engagements, we need to have them more and more often, and we need to look at who we are as Africans. When we look at our heritage, when we introspect, we should reflect more candidly. And I love the fact that the conversation this afternoon was delivered in a very frank manner. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We look forward to engaging with you, and thank you very much to our organizers, CAPSI. We also had staff from AUD and NEPAD who worked a lot behind the scenes. We had staff working from Mandela Institute for Development Studies, as well as our colleagues from Hadithi, Africa. We thank you for making this engagement possible, and we look forward to further engaging with you. Have a pleasant evening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.